I remember the exact moment because the syrup on the conference table was still warm when Brandon told me my role no longer aligned with modernization goals. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just nodded, folded the termination letter, and walked out while everyone pretended nothing cruel had happened. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the moment he cut me loose, he also activated something I'd quietly prepared years ago. If you've ever dealt with a boss who thought you were powerless, stay with me. And before we dive in, subscribe and tell me your worst workplace betrayal. I never imagined 13 years of loyalty would end over lukewarm pancakes and a stack of flimsy paper plates, but that morning proved just how small people can be when they think no one is watching. The company called it a team appreciation brunch, which should have been my first warning, because North Peak never gave us anything unless they were trying to soften a blow. Still, I showed up early like I always did, partly because old habits die hard, and partly because I figured I'd get a few quiet minutes before the day exploded into meetings. Instead, I walked into a room that smelled like maple syrup and fear. Brandon stood near the front, brushing crumbs off his brand new blazer, as if the entire morning were a minor inconvenience in his very important schedule. He wasn't subtle about enjoying his authority. His voice carried too loudly, his smile was too practiced, and everyone gave him that tight courtesy grin people reserve for someone they secretly hate but can't afford to cross. I took a seat near the back, next to Sandra, who looked like she hadn't slept. She whispered that Brandon had been pacing since 7, making the interns rearrange the same stack of plates 3 times. That was typical of him, fixating on what didn't matter while ignoring the structures holding the company together. But what struck me most that morning wasn't his arrogance. It was the way people avoided my eyes. Their heads stayed low as if they all expected something and didn't want to get caught in the crossfire when it happened. Brandon tapped his glass with a fork, though it was unnecessary because the room was already too quiet. "This is an important moment for North Peak," he said, acting like we were about to win an award instead of walking into a slaughterhouse. He launched into some tired monologue about restructuring, alignment, long-term vision, corporate filler that has never meant anything good in the history of employment. People shifted, glanced toward the exits, pretended to sip coffee they no longer wanted. I sat there calmly, taking in the scene. I'd been through enough reorganizations to recognize the smell of impending loss. What I didn't expect was how casually he'd do it. No dignity, no privacy, no respect. When he finally reached for the stack of papers beside him, the air tightened. He flattened the "ow" list with his palm, and for a moment, I swear he looked excited like a kid unwrapping a present. Then the names began. One by one, soft gasps from across the room, a muffled curse, a chair scraping the floor, a few people trembling so badly their styrofoam cups crinkled in their grip. And then my name, last, drawn out for effect, Jane Calder. It sliced through the room sharper than anything he said before. Brandon didn't even look at me when he added, "Your role has been eliminated effective immediately." It was the offhand cruelty that hit hardest, the way he moved on before the words settled. Sandra grabbed my wrist under the table. I could feel her shaking, not me. I let go gently. I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing pain. I stood, smoothed my shirt, and let my eyes sweep the room. Half of them wouldn't meet my gaze, but the other half wore expressions that told me everything. They weren't shocked. They just wished it hadn't happened in front of them. Brandon continued talking, already shifting to some hollow promise about future-forward operational efficiency. But I barely heard him, because as I walked toward the door, something old and familiar surfaced inside me. A memory, a contract, a clause they had all forgotten. And for the first time that morning, I felt something dangerously close to calm. When I got home that morning, the silence in my apartment felt heavier than anything Brandon had thrown at me. I dropped my keys in the bowl by the door, kicked off my shoes, and stood there for a long moment, letting the reality settle. Not the firing itself, but the way it had been done. Public, careless, stripped of humanity. That kind of cruelty doesn't leave you angry at first. It leaves you hollow. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stared at the faint rings on the table where I'd left paperwork during late-night marathons. 13 years of decisions, deadlines, roadmaps, and documentation lived in this home, scattered through drawers and old binders, because I never fully separated my work from my life. North Peak had taken so much of my time that the lines blurred without me noticing. Now they had cut me loose as if all those years were just a scheduling error. I sat down at my dining table, pulled my bag closer, and unfolded the termination letter. The language was clinical, but there were two words that kept echoing: without cause. People underestimate those words. They think they're just a formality companies use to avoid confrontation. I knew better. Without cause unlocks things, protects things. It shifts leverage in ways people like Brandon never consider because they assume they'll never face consequences. I opened the storage cabinet that hadn't been touched in months and pulled out a worn cardboard box labeled Old Docs. Inside were scraps from another life, training manuals from when North Peak was just 10 people in a rented floor, doodled prototypes, and a stack of contracts held together by a rubber band that had dried and snapped in my hand. I sifted through the papers until I found the original employment packet I signed on my first day. The pages were yellowed at the edges, stained with coffee rings and years of being shoved in and out of binders. Back then, I was one of the earliest hires, back when the founder cared more about ideas than optics. I remembered how desperate they were to recruit someone who actually understood process design, compliance mapping, and operational continuity. They needed me to build the foundation so they could sell the dream, and they sweetened the offer with flexibility that would never exist today. I flipped page after page until I reached the one I was looking for, Section 11B. The memory of negotiating it came back as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. Me sitting across from the founder at a wobbly table, him promising creative freedom and ownership, me countering with one request: a guarantee that anything I created independently, documented separately, or architected without company resources would remain under my rights if I ever left without cause. He agreed instantly. He even joked that if they ever forgot why the company functioned, I'd be the one to remind them. I ran my finger down the paragraph. In the event of termination without documented cause, the employee retains exclusive rights to all independently developed operational frameworks, authorizations, and continuity protocols. Most people reading that would skim right past without understanding its weight. Brandon certainly had. HR clearly hadn't. Legal never checked the old archives, but I had. I always remembered. Because I knew one thing they didn't: the entire company still depended on the operational frameworks I had built in those early years. Frameworks layered into every division, every client deliverable, every renewal contract. And now, thanks to Brandon's little brunch spectacle, every single one of those frameworks legally belonged to me. I didn't act immediately. People assume revenge is a single explosive moment, but the truth is, it often begins quietly, in the stillness after humiliation, when your mind sharpens in ways it never does when life is stable. I spent the rest of that morning going through my old files, confirming what I already suspected. Every major process North Peak relied on, every audit workflow, continuity protocol, and multi-department approval chain, ran through frameworks I had built from scratch back when the company was held together with hope and cheap office furniture. Over the years, newer managers had added shiny layers on top, but the skeleton beneath was still mine. And now, legally, it was mine alone. To be clear, nothing I created was malicious, hidden, or designed for sabotage. It was simply good architecture: centralized permissions, department-level authorizations, and protected continuity, triggers that required designated oversight. For years, that oversight was me. When I left, my authorization lapsed automatically. It was an elegant safety measure the founder praised at the time because it prevented unauthorized changes. Ironically, it now meant that the second Brandon eliminated my role without cause, the system logic recognized that the oversight position no longer existed, and several processes quietly shifted into protective mode. Not shut down, not broken, just unpaused, waiting for the proper authorization they no longer had. I didn't touch a thing. I didn't need to. My job that day was simply to document. I printed copies of Section 11B. I highlighted the relevant portions. I drafted a clean summary for my attorney, When I texted him, he called me almost immediately. His voice low and delighted in that way lawyers get when they realize the universe has handed them a beautifully structured gift. They didn't review the original agreement? He asked. No, I said. Brandon didn't even know it existed. And all continuity protocols still run through your independent framework? Every single one. He exhaled, the slow kind that means opportunity is blooming. Then don't initiate anything yet. Just monitor. Let them make the first move. That's exactly what I did. The next morning, around 9:30, the first message came in. Sandra. Short, frantic. Have you heard anything about the project queues freezing? Then another from a junior analyst. The compliance approval chain won't validate. It says they're escalating. By noon, 3 more messages, then 6, then 11. None of them accused me. None of them even suspected me. They were just people watching the machine they relied on start to stutter. From my living room, I opened my laptop, logged into the external oversight dashboard, the one tied to my rights, not theirs, and saw what I expected. A cascade of stalled requests piling up behind authorization points that no longer existed. Nothing destructive, nothing dramatic. Just the first crack in a structure built on taking my work for granted. I closed the laptop gently. There was no satisfaction yet, only confirmation. They had removed the one person responsible for holding the internal machinery together and assumed everything would run the same. They never understood that continuity isn't automatic, it's maintained. It was early still. Too early for panic, too early for fallout. But as I sat back in my chair, sipping water in the quiet calm they'd handed me, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The real consequences hadn't even started. By Tuesday morning, whatever thin layer of confidence North Peak's leadership had left was beginning to peel back. I woke up to 23 unread messages, some from former teammates, others from people I barely knew, but who suddenly realized that the quiet woman they'd watched get dismissed over brunch had been the one, holding half the company's operational spine together. I didn't respond, not yet. I simply scrolled, absorbing the unfolding unraveling like someone watching storm clouds gather from a safe distance. The first sign of real trouble appeared at 8:17 a.m. when an entire chain of quarterly review packets failed to advance to department heads. These packets weren't optional, they were required for client renewals. When they froze, everything downstream froze with them. Then the vendor compliance checks locked into pending mode. Then the client onboarding workflows stalled. Within 90 minutes, the company's rhythm, the steady hum I had kept alive for 13 years, developed a hitch, then a limp, then something that looked dangerously close to paralysis. Again, none of this was because I did something. I hadn't lifted a finger. The frameworks were built to prevent unauthorized or unmonitored changes. Remove the overseer, and the system defaulted to protection. A simple, logical safeguard. One Brandon had never bothered to understand. At 10:03, Sandra called me. I let it ring out the first time, but when she tried again, I answered. Her voice was tight, hurried, like she was speaking while rushing down a hallway. Jane, everything is jamming, she whispered. The queues, the approvals, the renewal packets. Nothing is moving. They've pulled everyone into the main conference room. I don't know what's going on, but Brandon looks terrified. I leaned back against my couch, staring at the ceiling. Sandra, did anyone mention Section 11B? There was a long pause. No, should they have? They should, I said softly. I didn't elaborate. She didn't press. She never had. She just exhaled shakily, muttered something about being needed in another meeting, and hung up. That was the moment I realized the fear wasn't limited to confusion. It was beginning to spread, especially among the managers who had spent years assuming the operational groundwork would magically sustain itself indefinitely. Magic, it seemed, had run out. By lunchtime, my attorney forwarded me a copy of a message he'd received from North Peak's legal department. It was a preliminary inquiry, asking whether I might be able to provide temporary consulting support for disruptions that had arisen following my involuntary departure. I smiled at the phrasing. They hadn't used the words immediate, urgent, or critical, but the tone was frantic beneath the legal politeness. They were trying to keep the door open without admitting fault. My attorney's response was precise. Ms. Calder acknowledges receipt of your inquiry. Before any discussion can occur, all parties must confirm recognition of Section 11B in the original employment agreement. That was the first blow. The second landed later that afternoon around 3:40 p.m. when a regional client, one of their larger accounts, posted publicly on LinkedIn complaining that North Peak's renewal systems were experiencing unexpected operational delays. They didn't mention me or know the cause, but public frustration spreads quickly, especially when other clients begin chiming in with similar experiences. I refreshed the post twice. By the third refresh, it had 38 comments. By the 10th, nearly 100. Inside the company, I knew chaos had shifted into full sprint, not because I heard from them directly, but because someone anonymously forwarded me a screenshot of an internal leadership meeting agenda titled Continuity Breakdown Immediate Priorities. Under it, 1. Authorization freeze. 2. Client escalations. 3. Framework ownership confirmation. I read it twice, then set my phone down and let a slow, steady breath fill my lungs. They had reached the stage where denial fades and panic takes its place. And all I had done, literally all, was leave when they told me to. The earthquake hadn't been triggered by revenge. It had been triggered by their own ignorance, arrogance, and a brunch decision they thought would save them a salary. They had no idea it was about to cost them something much bigger. By Wednesday morning, North Peak's crisis was no longer an internal embarrassment. It was a public spectacle, unfolding in real time across inboxes, industry forums, and the kind of LinkedIn posts companies pray no one ever writes. I woke up before sunrise, not because I was anxious, but because a vibration from my phone wouldn't stop. Dozens of notifications, dozens of new messages. Half asleep, I scrolled through them and immediately understood. The meltdown had spilled into daylight. A national client, one of those accounts Brandon used to brag about during staff meetings as if he personally earned them, had emailed every regional director, CCing a few people who definitely shouldn't have been CC'd, complaining that their audit preparation tools were unusable. "We expect immediate resolution," they wrote. "This disruption is unacceptable." That email had been forwarded to me by 3 different former co-workers within the first hour, not because they blamed me, but because they knew exactly what the root cause was. The company had removed the only person who understood the interconnected machinery they leaned on. Public pressure is a funny thing. Companies can tolerate private chaos for quite a while, but the moment clients start asking questions that sound like lawsuits waiting to happen, panic blooms fast. By 7:40 a.m., a post appeared on a compliance professionals forum. "Is anyone else experiencing North Peak delays? Their renewal approvals have been stuck for days." Replies came instantly. People from industries I'd never even worked with chimed in. Insurance, logistics, banking, each reporting similar freezes. None of them knew about me. None of them needed to. They only knew that North Peak's reputation was slipping through its fingers. At 9:12 a.m., Sandra texted, "They're bringing in experts." She included the quotation marks herself. A moment later, she added, "They don't know what they're doing. Of course they didn't." North Peak had always been obsessed with surface-level solutions, quick fixes, new hires with flashy resumes, expensive consultants who charged more for PowerPoint slides than practical work. I refreshed my email again. A new message popped up, forwarded from someone anonymous within the company. It was a screenshot of a Slack thread titled Urgent Systems Freeze. Inside, one manager asked whether anyone had verified framework ownership. Another replied that legal was reviewing historical agreements, which made me laugh out loud. Historical agreements. That was a polite way of saying they were frantically digging through archives trying to find a loophole that didn't exist. Around lunchtime, the meltdown gained a new layer, visibility. A well-known tech compliance blogger published a subtle but pointed post. When companies downsize the wrong role, operational continuity takes the hit. The article didn't name North Peak, but commenters didn't need more than a breadcrumb. They connected the dots in minutes, referencing client outages, delays, and a leadership team slow to communicate. Meanwhile, North Peak's official social media accounts posted the blandest statement imaginable. We are currently enhancing internal workflows to better serve our customers. Anyone with half a brain knew that translation. We have no idea how to fix this, and we're hoping you don't notice. But people noticed. By mid-afternoon, I received another anonymous screenshot, this time of a leadership Zoom call. Brandon looked like he hadn't slept. The VP of operations had her head in her hands. Someone had circled a line in the meeting notes. Need immediate clarification, Ray, Section 11B. Beneath it, another handwritten note. Who approved termination without cause? I sat back on my couch, folded my hands in my lap, and exhaled slowly. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just resolute. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I hadn't pushed a button, blocked access, or touched a single system. The public meltdown, the client outrage, the internal panic, they were consequences born entirely from their own decision. A decision they made over pancakes, thinking I'd walk quietly into unemployment while their operation carried on unchanged. But operations don't run on arrogance. They run on the people who built them. And North Peak was finally learning what happens when you forget that. By Thursday morning, the situation had escalated beyond anything I expected. Faster, louder, and far more public. I was pouring myself a second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed with a message from one of the senior analysts I used to mentor. It contained only 4 words. She's flying back early. For a second, I didn't understand. Then it clicked. She meant Claire Ashford, the founder, the woman who built North Peak from a cramped co-working space with 2 interns and a printer that jammed every 8 pages. She almost never came to the office anymore. She spent most of her time consulting internationally or speaking at conferences about scaling responsibly. If Claire was coming back early, something catastrophic had happened. And North Peak didn't bring Claire back for disputes, inefficiencies, or mild crises. They brought her back for fires. By noon, a photo surfaced online. Someone in the office had snapped a picture of Claire striding through the lobby, hair pulled back, expression carved from stone. Even through the blurry quality, she looked furious in a way only a founder can be, betrayed, disappointed, and deeply tired of other people's incompetence. Sandra called me moments after the photo started circulating. Her voice was stretched thin. She's already in the boardroom. They locked the glass doors. Brandon's pacing like a trapped animal. Did they say why she came back? I asked, though I already knew. 3 clients threatened contract withdrawal this morning. Half the project queues are stuck, and someone leaked the memo about continuity framework ownership under review. Claire saw it. Sandra paused. Jane, she asked who approved your termination. No one had an answer. I could picture the room, Claire sitting at the head of the table, the board members avoiding eye contact, Brandon running out of excuses. For years, people whispered about how sharp she could be when someone endangered what she built. Now they were seeing it firsthand. Around 2 in the afternoon, my attorney forwarded me an email that had been sent from North Peak's general counsel. It was brief, but frantic. We request immediate clarification regarding ownership rights, authorization controls, and continuity frameworks attributed to Ms. Calder. The paragraph beneath was an even clearer sign of desperation. We would appreciate an opportunity to discuss temporary access reinstatement. Temporary access reinstatement. That was their polite way of saying fix everything for us, but we refuse to acknowledge why this is happening. My attorney's reply was colder than mine could have been. Before any discussions, North Peak must formally acknowledge the binding validity of Section 11B. Ms. Calder will not engage in corrective work without written recognition. At 3:11 p.m., Sandra called again. She didn't bother with greetings. Jane, Claire is livid. At who? Everyone, especially Brandon. She asked him why he thought it was appropriate to terminate the person who built the company's operational backbone without consulting anyone. I could hear murmuring behind her, the hum of voices in panic mode. Brandon told her he wanted to modernize outdated processes. She asked him which ones. He didn't know how to answer. I didn't respond, Sandra continued. Then she asked him if he had reviewed your original employment agreement. He said he didn't think it was necessary because the new leadership vision didn't rely on legacy contracts. There was a long silence before Sandra added, voice low. Claire said, "You fired the architect without checking who owned the blueprints." I felt something shift inside me. Not joy, not vindication, but a long-delayed sense of balance reasserting itself. Natural consequences, unfolding exactly as they should. Another hour passed before the next blow hit North Peak. An industry journalist published a breaking story summarizing the delays, the client complaints, and the rumor that a foundational oversight removal had triggered an internal collapse. The story didn't mention my name. It didn't have to. People inside the industry could connect dots faster than leadership ever had. By evening, Sandra texted me again. "Brandon's locked in a private meeting with Claire and the board. He looks sick. They know it's tied to your termination." I stared at the message for a long moment. I wasn't surprised. How could I be? The truth had always been simple. I didn't break North Peak. They broke themselves the moment they assumed my work didn't matter. And Claire, the only person who truly understood the early days, was finally reminding them why it did. I was heating leftovers for dinner when the email finally arrived, the one I'd been expecting since the moment Brandon said my name over brunch, though I didn't know what form it would take. The subject line was simple: proposal for collaboration, not apology, not acknowledgement, not responsibility, collaboration. I opened it and felt my mouth curve into a humorless smile. The message was a polished attempt at humility, written in that tone corporations use when they're desperate, but still trying to preserve dignity. They expressed sincere regret for any inconvenience caused by recent events and invited me to rejoin North Peak on a temporary consulting basis to restore operational continuity. They used words like valued expertise, historic contributions, and mutual benefit. But the line that made me set the fork down was this: "We hope to resolve ongoing issues swiftly with your support while we review legacy contractual matters." Legacy contractual matters. That was how they described Section 11B, my rights, my safeguards, the agreement made in good faith 13 years ago. Legacy as if it were optional. I forwarded the email to my attorney and wrote only, "Your move." He called me almost instantly. "Jane, they still haven't acknowledged the clause. They want you to fix their mess without admitting why you're in a position to do so." "I know," I said. "Let's give them the terms." The next message North Peak received was short, sharp, and impossible to misinterpret. It outlined 3 non-negotiables: written recognition of Section 11B, acknowledgement that all operational frameworks defaulted to my ownership upon termination without cause, and a commercial licensing fee to reinstate usage rights, priced at $1.1 million. Not a cent less. It wasn't revenge pricing. It was the market rate for 13 years of foundational architecture that kept their business breathing. For an hour, there was silence. Then 2. Then 3. I didn't pace. I didn't check my phone nonstop. I cleaned the kitchen. I answered a message from my aunt. I folded laundry. Around 8:30 p.m., Sandra called. She didn't bother explaining how she learned what she knew. I didn't ask. "They're stunned," she whispered. "Brandon called it extortion. Claire shut him down in front of everyone. She said, 'This isn't extortion. This is reckoning.'" I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone pressed to my ear, listening as Sandra described the meeting unraveling inside the glass boardroom I once walked past every morning. She said the board had demanded full details from legal. She said Claire made them pull my old contract onto the projector. She said Section 11B was highlighted in red. And she said that when Brandon realized what he had handed me, what he had triggered with his thoughtless termination, his face drained of every ounce of color. "He keeps saying he didn't know," Sandra murmured. "He keeps insisting nobody told him." I closed my eyes. It was his job to know. She didn't argue. A few hours later, my attorney forwarded the official response. North Peak acknowledged Section 11B in full. They accepted the commercial license fee. They agreed to my ownership of all operational frameworks. They requested immediate reinstatement of continuity access upon receipt of funds. At 11:14 p.m., a final email arrived from Claire herself. Not a form letter, not a corporate template, a short, direct message. Jane, the company's future depends on correcting this mistake. I won't pretend we handled your departure with integrity. Thank you for giving us a path forward. 5 minutes later, my banking app chimed. Wire transfer received. 7 figures. Clean, confirmed, irrevocable. I set the phone down, leaned back in my chair, and let the stillness settle around me. They had finally understood the price of forgetting who built their foundation. And now they were paying it. The morning after the wire transfer cleared, I woke to a stillness I hadn't felt in years. No urgent messages, no calendar alarms, no sense of responsibility hanging over my head like an unpaid debt. Just quiet sunlight across my kitchen and the knowledge that the company I once held together had finally acknowledged the truth. Publicly, financially, and undeniably. I opened my fridge and saw the leftover breakfast from the brunch, the same stale pastries they'd used as a backdrop for my firing. I reheated a blueberry muffin, watched it turn soft in the microwave, and took a bite. It tasted nothing like justice, but the moment did. Justice wasn't in the food. It was in the balance being restored. Later that morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Sandra. A photo came through first. Brandon packing his office, cardboard box under his arm, face pale and tight. Her message followed. He's stepping down, effective immediately. I sat down slowly, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Not satisfaction, not schadenfreude, just release, a weight slipping off my shoulders. Another message arrived from a coworker I barely knew well, someone from finance who had always kept to herself. Thank you for standing up, she wrote. Some of us never could. It struck me harder than the payment ever could. For years, people swallowed disrespect quietly because they believed they didn't have options. Maybe now they'd think twice before letting someone diminish their worth. By noon, my LinkedIn inbox was overflowing with job invitations, consulting offers, and messages from people who had watched North Peaks unraveling from afar. I didn't respond to any of them yet. I needed space. I needed air. I needed to let this chapter close without rushing into the next. I went for a walk around my neighborhood, letting the cold air sting my cheeks, grounding me back into myself. 13 years of carrying a company on my back had finally lifted. That evening, I sat at my dining table. No paperwork, no crisis, no late-night documentation. Just me, a cup of tea, and the realization that my future finally belonged to me again. Before bed, I opened a blank document and typed the first line of my new venture proposal for the consulting firm I'd always imagined but never had time to build. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't rebuilding something for someone else. I was building something for me. I didn't realize how much strength I carried until everything I built slipped out of my hands in a single morning. That's the part no one warns you about, the quiet power you don't recognize until someone tries to strip it away. When they fired me over brunch, I walked out feeling hollow but not broken. The truth is, my strength wasn't loud or impressive. It lived in the years of documentation I kept, the details I never forgot, the clauses I fought for when no one thought they mattered. It lived in patience, the kind you develop only after surviving leadership that thinks chaos is innovation and disrespect is efficiency. When the company unraveled, I didn't celebrate. I just watched. Calm, steady, aware, because I knew what they didn't. Preparation isn't dramatic until the day it saves you. And on that day, it speaks louder than any speech or confrontation ever could. If there's one thing I hope people take from my experience, it's this. Quiet doesn't mean powerless. Being underestimated doesn't mean you're overlooked by fate. Sometimes the smallest things you protect, your notes, your boundaries, your contracts, become the one shield no one saw coming. So here are a few things I'd tell a friend sitting across from me, wondering if they should bother holding on to the details. Trust your memory. It will save you when the world tries to rewrite the story. Document everything, even when it feels unnecessary. Don't rush into retaliation. Timing is its own advantage. Honor your own work, especially when others take it for granted. And above all, stay patient. Quiet strength has a way of showing up exactly when it's needed. How to get started today? Keep personal copies of important agreements. Write short weekly summaries of what you build or manage. Save emails documenting decisions and contributions. Protect your boundaries early instead of after the damage. Practice staying calm when others expect you to panic. What's one moment where your preparation paid off when no one expected it?